I will explain the uncontrolled and controlled components with simple and practical examples in React and Next.js. We use Next.js and some minimal styles for the form and inputs. Uncontrolled and controlled components are terms used to describe React components that render HTML form elements, so it's all about forms. Every time we create a React component that renders an HTML form element, we are creating one of those too. We start by creating a form that collects product inputs. A product has a title, a description, and other fields that we will see later. Each form element contains a value. The value may be typed input, text area, or selected checkbox, select, radio button by the user or browser. When the element's value is changed, triggered by the act of typing or selecting, it is updated accordingly. In the case of uncontrolled components, a reference is created using useRef hook, which will store the input for the title. The reference is transmitted to the input element through the property ref. As with any form, we also need a submit input, which, when clicked, will execute the handle submit function. An uncontrolled component is a component that renders form elements where the form element's data is handled by the DOM, default DOM behavior. To access the input's DOM node and extract its value, we use a reference. The value stored in the title is accessed through input_title.current.value. We write a handler to monitor when the input value changes as we type new characters. Now, the problem is that we want to display the title length on the screen. As you can see, this is difficult for uncontrolled components. We don't even bother anymore because we will still see how controlled components solve the problem extremely quickly. In React, an input type file is always an uncontrolled component because its value can only be set by a user, not programmatically. Uncontrolled and controlled components differ in the way they access the data from the form elements like inputs, text areas, selects, and so on. Controlled components. Now we turn the form that uses uncontrolled components into one that uses controlled components. Instead of reference, we will store the value of the title in the state of the component. This is the most important difference between an uncontrolled and a controlled component. In the uncontrolled components, references to the nodes in the DOM are used to access the value entered by the user, and the controlled ones use the state. A controlled component is one that takes its current value through props and notifies changes through callbacks like onChange. A parent component controls it by handling the callback and managing its own state and passing the new values as props to the controlled component. You could also call this a DOM component. An uncontrolled component is one that stores its own state internally, and you query the DOM using a ref to find its current value when you need it. This is a bit more like traditional HTML. Since an uncontrolled component keeps the source of truth in the DOM, it is sometimes easier to integrate React and non-React code when using uncontrolled components. It can also be slightly less code if you want to be quick and dirty. Otherwise, you should usually use controlled components. A controlled component is a component that renders form elements and controls them by keeping the form data in the component state. In a controlled component, the form elements data is handled by the React component, not DOM, and kept in the component state. A controlled component basically overrides the default behavior of the HTML form elements. We create a controlled component by connecting the form element input, text area, or select to the state by setting its attribute value and the event onChange. In HTML, form elements such as those enumerated before typically maintain their own state and update it based on user input. In React, mutable state is typically kept in the state property of components and only updated with setState. We can combine the two by making the React state be the single source of truth. Then the React component that renders a form also controls what happens in that form on subsequent user input. An input form element whose value is controlled by React in this way is called a controlled component. Overall, this makes it so that inputs of type text, text area, and select all work very similarly. They all accept a value attribute that you can use to implement a controlled component. The React is the one in control, so it is predictable what values the components have. Instead, more problems may occur in the case of uncontrolled components, such as the loss of reference or change of values from the outside. We can perform validation easily and reactively even after a user types letter. The only input type that is always an uncontrolled component is the file type. The description is collected by a text area element. We also add a category that can be selected from a drop-down. If we want to extend the form, we will have to add an onChange handler for each input, but we can make a more generic one. Let's see how. To set the correct type and have IntelliSense, first we need to cast a noun and then HTML input element. we add radio inputs to select a single currency from several options. The currency must be of type string because it ultimately stores a single value. And now the big question: what type of component should we use? Controlled or uncontrolled? There is no clear answer. It all depends on how much control you want over the components and your knowledge. Personally, I recommend the use of controlled components as the React team recommends us, and from experience it is much better to work with them, but this is not necessarily a rule. Identify your needs and use what is best for you. Now you know better the differences between the two. If you want to get rid of all the hassle of writing forms, I invite you to watch the tutorial on React Hook Form, where you'll learn how to quickly build complex forms with validation or with TypeScript support. If you have any questions, ask in the comments section. What did you learn from this tutorial? I invite you to subscribe, like and share to learn programming fast. Activate notifications by clicking on the bell. Thanks for watching!